thank you very much for coming to this super event. It's called Cybersecurity for Humans. And I noticed that most of you appear not to be cyborgs, but humans. So I imagine there's a very human interest in this topic. I hope you've had some food and drink, because unusually we've arranged for some food today before the event. Also, at this event, it's our first time having an ISACA event here at BCS, although some of you may be familiar with this venue already. This is the new BCS headquarters, and it leaves some questions in terms of capacity and so on. The capacity of this room is 90 people, so there is a teeny bit of extra room, but it's for 90 people. It feels quite crowded because in BCS before, there was room for 120. But careful analysis of statistics shows that our events usually have not more than this number of people, apart from one or two. Now, if you'd like to encourage lots of your friends to come to ISACA events, then let's see if we can really get a huge room full of people next time. Meanwhile, tonight, I need to tell you first of all about some of the BCS rules for the venue. By that, I mean that there is no fire alarm scheduled for this evening. So if you hear any bells, we need to go out either to the right, following the sign indicated by the little white figure on the green background, and that will take us out into the street, or go left, and likewise there'll be a figure there. We follow that out into the street and meet outside. There is also something else, of course, which is if you need to use the facilities, you're welcome to do so. The washrooms, the toilets, are literally behind this room. So you go round and to the back of this room. That is where the toilets are. Feel free to use those, but the only thing is, please try not to disturb too many people in your row as you go out, of course. Now, is anybody here not an ISACA member? One or two people. Okay, well, welcome. And I think you'll see the wonderful world of ISACA as we proceed through the evening. The schedule this evening is as follows. My name is Dalim. I'm the events director for ISACA London chapter, and a number of my colleagues from the ISACA board are here tonight. So you'll be able to see more of them later, but meanwhile, would ISACA board members please raise their hands? Great, okay. So there are some people who will be able to answer your ISACA questions very exactly later during the breaks. And in terms of the breaks, the schedule we've got for you is this, that we will have our first speaker who is going to speak on security awareness via behavioral science, and that talk will end at 6:50 p.m. After that, we'll have a 10-minute break. Then we'll have our second speaker, and his talk will last until 7:30. I beg your pardon, we'll start at 7:30 and last until 8:20. Then at 8:20, I'll give some closing remarks and so on, and we'll split up. We'll go outside. There's food and drink, should be plenty of it, next door, where you've seen some already. And we'll go into informal networking mode, which is often great fun and very much looked forward to by lots of people. So 3 components for you. One is the presentations and the very important ISACA-related things you'll hear there. 2 is information about ISACA itself. And 3 is the networking, where you can meet and talk with other people. Great. Okay, so here is a little bit of detail about what I've told you. We have 2 speakers, and the first speaker, who is called Mike Butler, Dr. Mike Butler, is the CTO of Think Cybersecurity Limited. Now, Mike's subject is security awareness via behavioral science. And in case you can't read the writing, let me just read it to you. This topic is about the application of behavioral science to security awareness. And we'll be talking about how various behavioral change models work. We'll be thinking about how they're relevant to security awareness. And we'll look at some case studies of applying them in practice. So that's the gist of Mike's talk, Dr. Mike Butler. And his time will end at 1850, 10 to 7. Then we'll have then we'll have. I'm getting this completely wrong. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm hoping somebody will put me right here. Mike will talk from 10 to 7 until 20 past 7. Is that right, Mike? Mike says yes, so that must be good. Then we'll have our 10-minute break. And then we'll have somebody who is a well-known figure to ISACA audiences. Rafe Muvisser is the author of Cybersecurity for Beginners and numerous other books relating to cybersecurity. He's also the director of Cybersecurity Limited. And his topic will be how to hack a human, with examples of covert human persuasion and how cybersecurity principles can be applied to defend the human mind. And you can see I'm in a twist about timings here, but it says here, Rafe will speak from 7:30 till 8:20. Rafe?
Yeah, 8:20 tomorrow.
8:20, yeah, 8:20, sorry. Of course, I didn't put AM or PM. Rafe will speak, or could speak, till 8:20 tomorrow morning. It's our task, and I want you to join me in this, to stop him from doing so. But if he's particularly fascinating, then to take him outside and listen to him some more. Yeah. If you brought your sleeping bag, you're well prepared. Good. All right. So let me not make a fluff of any more times and dates and all that sort of thing. Let me ask you to... Oh, hello, Ken. Well, I've been justifiably ticked off by Ken there for forgetting to mention that all ISACA members should register, should make sure that Yeshko, who is the lady in the corner there, and has the magic barcodes, wow, has your details. That way we will make sure within ISACA that you get your CPEs. The registration you've come through is BCS, i.e. Building Security. So please see Yeshko, possibly during the break, to make sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mike Butler.
I'm the CTO of a company called Think Cybersecurity, and I'm going to talk to you for the next 15 to 20 minutes, maybe longer, maybe shorter, who knows, about the topic of behaviour science and give you some ideas about how it applies to security awareness. I guess my success factor for this talk, my aim for this talk, is to hopefully give you some new ideas and thinking about how you might think about security awareness. I'm kind of not trying to cover the full details of behaviour science in all its glory. Anyway, I was going to start with a bit of interactivity just to get things going. Right, okay, show of hands. So, how many people have been the subject of or been the receiving end of some security awareness in the room? Yeah, good. I was expecting... keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Yeah. And how many people change their behaviour or think they change their behaviour as a result of that security awareness? Okay, that's fine. Okay, that was more hands than I was expecting, but that's fine. That's okay. In my notes here, I said I'm not sure how many hands I'm going to get, but anyway. So the problem we talk about here is that the internet's great because you can get statistics on anything, right? Well, the statistic I've got here is that 90% of successful cyber attacks start with a human user. That may or may not be true, but let's assume that quite a few cyber attacks have a human user in the loop. And another statistic, which is from the Information Security Foundation, so it's a relatively reliable statistic, is that less than 15% of people actually change their behaviour as a result of security awareness training. So we have potentially a problem. Lots of security incidents as a result of human behaviour, but the training and awareness piece only changes behaviour 15% of the time. So this talk, the idea of this talk is to try and talk about how you increase the 15% in order to try and reduce that 90% figure. And that's the topic I'm going to be talking about. Okay. Right. Very briefly, I'll whistle through this slide, a bit about me. So I am a member of the ISACA London chapter, so quite often I'm sitting over there. Sort of more comfortable over there. I'm CTO of a company called Think Cybersecurity. I guess my career, whistle-top tour of my career thus far. So I started working for the Australian government, which is the CSIRO, researching or working on how Wi-Fi modems are built, or how good Wi-Fi modems are built. And funnily enough, not many people know this, but the Australian government has a patent on Wi-Fi. So they were a good place to work for, and they do quite well out of that. I then came home, or came back to the UK, and the majority of my career was working for a company called ISACA, which was a technology consultancy in the early 90s. It got acquired by BAE Systems, a big defence company, in the mid-2000s. And I did a variety of different roles at ISACA, but latterly I ran their global information security team, so I was their global head of information security. And that was when I got my CISM certification and joined the ISACA London chapter. And doing that role, I guess one of my key observations was the problem that I stated at the start. So I didn't think that the kind of de facto standard for security awareness, which in many organisations is kind of an annual training course and some phishing testing, didn't feel like that cut the mustard given the number of attacks that involved a human user. So I decided to go and set up a business to try and solve that problem, which is what Think Cybersecurity is. So interestingly, my co-founder at Think Cyber used to be the head of information services at ISACA, and those two roles, so the guy who runs the IT and the guy who secures the IT, often don't get on, or they kind of have a fractious relationship. But we got on so well that we set up a business together, so there we go. Anyway, I slightly digress from the topic, so I'll move on. So I'm going to start talking about some behaviour change models, and I've got four models to go through. And I guess to start with, I'll talk about, well, what is a behaviour change model? So these are things that have been developed by academics and researchers. They're based on quantitative measurements and experiments, and they're attempting to predict or explain how people change their behaviour. And they provide a framework for behavioural intervention. So if you want to change people's behaviour, then these models are quite useful. What they don't do, so there's a bit of a health warning, they're not kind of really detailed, intricate models about how people's brains operate and the various different processes that go on, because that's, so if that's what you're expecting, then you're going to be disappointed. What they are is simplified models of these things, and simplified models of how these things occur. So if that's what you're after, then hopefully you'll be happy. And often they're contingent on a good acronym, so you may wonder sometimes these models get developed because they form a nice acronym, but we'll see an example of that in a minute. So, right. So the first model, so I've got four of these, and then I've got what I call a meta model, but we'll start with the four models. So the first model is called protection motivation theory. So this theory says there are basically, when you're faced with a threat, your brain makes two assessments of that threat. A thing called the threat appraisal and a thing called the coping appraisal. So the threat appraisal is these two questions: how severe is the threat, and how vulnerable am I to the threat? So we could think about that as being similar to a kind of risk assessment type model. So what's the impact and what's the likelihood? So that's the threat side of things, and then there's a coping side of things. So your brain also thinks, well, okay, how can I cope with this threat? Am I able to do it effectively? So can I deal with this threat effectively? And secondly, what's the cost of making that response? And by cost, it doesn't mean like how many quids is it going to cost me. It's how much effort am I going to have to put into making this response. And you're all probably sitting there thinking, well, this is rubbish because I never think that when I'm faced with a threat. And that's kind of not quite the point. A lot of these things will happen. So your brain has two systems of thinking. One is called System 1, more commonly called System 1, which is kind of fast, instinctive thought. And the second one is System 2, which is more slow and deliberative. And these appraisals happened across those two systems, but you won't necessarily consciously think, oh, well, okay, gosh, there's this threat, I'm going to ask myself these 4 questions. But anyway, the model is that these are the 4 questions that you ask yourself. And I guess the interesting thing about this model, or the interesting conclusion that research has shown from this model, is that the coping appraisal is the thing that really matters. So protection motivation is how effectively you're going to deal with a particular threat. If you feel able to cope with that threat, then you're much more likely to actually deal with it. If you can't, then your protection motivation will be low, and you will either make an ineffective response or you won't make a response at all. But the key thing to draw from this model is about what they call self-efficacy, but it's your ability to cope that matters. So we often work with Northumbria University, and there's a professor there called Pam Briggs, and she summarises this by saying we should focus less on scaring people, so telling them about the threat and how bad the threat's going to be, and more on this is what you should do. This is what you should do to cope with the threat. So giving them tools to deal with it. So there we go. There's the first behaviour change model. I'm now going to. There's 2 more on this slide. So the first one is my favourite. There you go. I have a favourite behaviour change model, and it's from a Stanford academic called B.J. Fogg. And the second one is then going to be from the nudge unit, who you may or may not have heard of, but we'll get to that in a minute. So B.J. Fogg's model, these are both acronym based, so these are kind of easy to remember. So B.J. Fogg says the 3 factors you need for behaviour change to happen. Motivation, so the person who's going to change their behaviour needs to be motivated to change their behaviour. Ability, so the person needs to actually have the ability to change their behaviour in the way that they want to, or you want them to. And the third one is a prompt. So you have to have a prompt to change behaviour. So it doesn't happen, if you want to change people's behaviour, it doesn't happen for free. It probably doesn't happen if you give them half an hour of security awareness training every year, or half an hour of training a year. It's a continual thing, and you really have to work at it. And the thing about a prompt is that it's best delivered at what's called an opportune moment. And there's lots of kind of apps out there for dieting and for various that's a form of behaviour change. And all of those apps are trying to deliver prompts at opportune moments. So they're trying to identify, okay, when should I remind you to go and do your exercise, or when should I remind you about, the number of calories in X, Y, or Z. But it is kind of really key. If you actually want people to change their behaviour, you need to prompt them to do it, and that's hard. So that's B.J. Fogg, and we'll come back to motivation and ability because they're interesting. So the nudge unit model. So they're not actually called the nudge unit; they're called the behavioural insights team. Sorry. Anyway, they're a bunch of civil servants. Used to be in the cabinet office, but they apply nudge theory to various kind of aspects of government policy and increasingly to non-government policy. The thing about nudge is it's all about influencing decision making, which is really a form of behaviour change. So their model, again an acronym, is EAST. So an effective. So this is their rules for an effective nudge. So they say that it should be easy. So the thing you want somebody to do has to be easy. It should be attractive to them. It should be social, and it should be timely. Okay, I thought they've appeared. So this is actually quite similar to the BJ Fogg model. And, so motivation and easy are similar. So you have to make something easy. Ability and easy are similar. Motivation and attractive are similar. So if something's attractive, people are motivated to it. And timely and prompt are similar. So we're getting some similarities coming through the models. The thing that they add is social. So social proof is a really powerful motivator. So the best way of getting somebody to, or one of the most effective ways rather, of getting somebody to do something is to convince them that everybody else is doing it. Then social proof is high, and then they will act. In fact, that's not the only motivator. Pleasure, fear, and social acceptance are typically the three kind of motivators that you talk about. But the nudge unit model kind of draws out specifically social proof as being a key kind of motivating factor to behaviour change. So that's that one. One more. So the next one is McKinsey's influence model. So this is a bit different, in fact. This is more a model of how you manage transformational change or organisational transformational change, and which isn't surprising given McKinsey presumably advise companies on that quite a lot. But it's still interesting in terms of kind of individual behaviour change. So the McKinsey model says there are 4 building blocks of change. The first is seeing others behaving differently. So they call this role modelling. So again, there's a social proof aspect. If you see people doing a particular behaviour, then you're much more likely to do it yourself. The second factor is actually understanding what you're supposed to do, what the behaviour is, what the behaviour change required is, and that actually makes sense to you. So they see that as a key thing. You have skills and opportunities to behave differently. So basically you have the ability to do whatever behaviour you're being asked to do. And finally, it's a bit wordy, observing formal structures and processes supporting change. So this is about actually seeing that the wider organisation values the change that you're trying to make. So that's called the McKinsey influence model. So I'll combine these to a meta model. Right? This is great. So the meta model is that for behaviour change to happen, you need people to be willing, able, and ready, right? Which isn't quite the right order, but there we go. And if you could do all 3 of those things, then people will change their behaviour. So let's try getting the right button. Okay. So willing is all about motivation. So all of the models we talked about were about people are motivated, they perceive a particular change to be attractive to them. Social proof is about making them willing or motivated. They have role models and they're appraised of the threat that they're actually trying to deal with. So those are all things that have come out of the models which are to do with people's willingness to change. Ability. So people are actually able to make the change. So they actually have, it's very easy to ask people to make a change in a way that they actually can't do. It's impossible to them. And I'll kind of come on to that in some of the security awareness examples. But, as security people, we think about security all the time. People we're trying to convince to change their behaviour probably don't think about it very much, if at all. So we need to sometimes think about tempering how we're asking people to change according to in that way. So don't ask them to do too much. Don't expect too much of people. And ready comes back to this prompts, the business of prompts. So people need to receive prompts in order to change. So anyway, if we can do all those 3 of those things, we hit this magic point in the middle, and people will change their behaviour, it's easy, right? We can all do that. Maybe.
possible to ask a question now or at the end?
Can I go at the end? Can I say at the end? Is that okay? Yeah. I'll carry on. Otherwise, I'll.
Are you sharing the slides?
I think they will be shared. Yep. Yep. So a few more insights, just to kind of keep going on these models. So there is this relationship between willing and able, which is kind of important. And this is courtesy of B.J. Fogg, and he draws a graph. So this is the graph, and on the one side we've got ability, so either somebody's able to make a change or unable to make it. On the other side we've got willingness, either they're unwilling to make a change or they're willing, and there's a line. And basically, if you're above the line, so top right-hand corner, and you deliver a prompt at the right time, then somebody will change their behaviour. If you're below the line, so the bottom half, then and you deliver a prompt, people won't change their behaviour. Right. So there is this relationship between the two, and generally, if somebody's unwilling to make a change or change their behaviour, they need to be very, very able to make the change, which means it's really easy, right? So if you want somebody to do something against their will, then it better be pretty noddy, pretty easy for them to do. On the other side, if they're super willing, so they really, really want to change, then you can make whatever you're asking them to do a bit harder. And that's basically what that line is showing. But the reality, if we're talking about security awareness, which we are, the reality is that in general, people we're trying to convince to change their behaviour are going to be pretty unwilling. Right? So they're at this point, this top left-hand corner, and the kind of implication of that is that whatever we're going to ask them to do has got to be really easy. Right? If somebody's not willing or slightly reluctant to make their change or doesn't have time, then don't expect them to do something really difficult. And if you do, then they probably won't do it. So that's what this relationship is all about. So hopefully that kind of makes sense a bit, rings true. And the final point on this one is that, so effectively, P.J. Fogg has this idea of what he calls tiny habits. So the idea is that you accept, if you're in this position where somebody's going to be unwilling, you accept that they're going to be unwilling, and you start at this bottom or this top left-hand corner. So you basically accept they're going to be unwilling, so I'm going to start really easy. And all you try and do in the first instance is try and find something that you can persuade them to do that is super easy. And then you work your way down the line. So as people do that easy thing, they become more confident, their willingness grows and their ability grows. And then the next thing you can ask them to do is a bit harder. Okay? So you basically you try and traverse this line over time. So you start really, really easy, and then over time you can kind of, as people's confidence grows, their willingness grows, you can start to make it slightly harder.
I think in my experience everyone is there by that red line.
Yeah, well I think that's true. Yeah.
Because the more able somebody is,
Yeah.
the more inclined they are to want to do it their way and ignore everybody else's
Yep.
direction.
Yeah. So yes, that's just a couple more insights from our friend B.J. Fogg. So that's it with the models. Right, I've done models. I thought I'd make some final points. Oh. So we talked about a few things. I thought I'd summarise. So we've got this idea of threat versus coping. So how much do I need to know about the threat, and how much do I need to know about coping with the threat? And protection motivation told us that ability to cope is a better way of raising protection motivation. So focusing on what you can do about a threat rather than too much on this is what the threat's all about. So that's the first key point. The second one we've kind of just talked about, make it easy and as easy as possible, and be realistic about what you're asking people to do, and assume motivation is low, effectively. Social proof is a pretty essential motivating factor. So basically, if people see others doing an activity, then they're much more likely to do it themselves. So we can kind of take advantage of that. The third one, behaviour change doesn't happen without prompts and reminders. It's like, you know, we can try and change behaviour by doing half an hour a year or whatever it might be, or, you know, a bit a quarter. But really, if you really want to change people's behaviour, it has to be pretty much, well, not continuous, but you have to work kind of harder at it, and people really need to be prompted to make that change. And finally, other techniques are available. So I've talked about a few models, but there are other. I mean, we've kind of just, it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of behaviour change and behavioural science. So things like spaced learning, which is actually a learning science thing. So that's the idea that you learn something today, you learn something tomorrow, and you might learn it a week later. People retain that knowledge about double. So that's worth thinking about. If you give one person a one-shot kind of hit of information, they're X likely to retain it, where X is probably quite low. But if you tell them it once, tell them again, and then have a break and tell them a third time, they're 2 times X likely to remember it. So it's always worth knowing. And there's things like personalisation. So if you deliver somebody a personal message, then they're 30% plus more likely to respond to it. Again, worth knowing. And 30% might not seem like a lot, but if you can get 30% more people to respond to something in that way, then that's potentially quite powerful. But the key thing there is there's these are a few models we've touched on. There is loads of this kind of research and ideas out there. I've just picked out some of the ones that I thought were most appropriate. Okay, so I'm now going to try and apply some of this to security awareness. Right, this is the these are ideas, right? These aren't definitive answers, and you may sit there thinking, I don't agree with any of this, and that's fine. These are just some ideas about, okay, given a couple of security awareness use cases, how can we think about applying these models, and what do they actually mean when we come to the practice of doing it? That's what this kind of next section is about. So, I thought I'd try and tackle password hygiene. I mean, passwords are slightly going out of fashion, but not that much. Cloud services and things are driving people back towards, okay, I'm going to have lots of passwords that I need to think about and manage. So obviously there's technical ways of controlling passwords. Group policy is one in the Windows world, but there's lots of ways you can make people set a strong password. But that doesn't guarantee a good password, in fact. And really, the killer one is reuse. Like, in the world of passwords, people reusing passwords across their corporate account and their personal accounts is pretty dire, really, because we all know how many password breaches occur, on a regular basis. Well, if that happens to be a corporate password, that's bad, and that's difficult to control from a technical. To actually control that technically, it's pretty difficult. There's no technical control that you can apply that says, I know you've used that password for your personal Hotmail account, don't use it for corporate. So we're kind of forced to think about behaviour change for that kind of thing. And obviously people then iterate their passwords, although arguably there's technical controls available for that. Anyway, what I'm trying to do is think about password hygiene and how we apply these techniques. So I'm going to take our 3 areas, which were able, willing and ready in the meta model. So able was all about making it easy. So we might want to make it easy to remember. So there's a number of ways we can make passwords easy to remember. SSO, well, I guess at least that minimises the number of passwords people have to remember. I'm not sure whether people are familiar with the 3 random words way of setting passwords. So that's basically where you form a long password out of 3 random unconnected words. So that's actually quite easy for people to remember compared to a load of random characters and a few special characters, a number, a digit, a capital letter. A 3 random word password will probably be a stronger password than any of those, and much easier to remember. So that's a good way of making the behaviour easy, or the behaviour of good hygiene easy for people. allowing people who actually have to manage lots of passwords to use password managers. That's another kind of ease factor. So rather than having to remember them all myself, I can store them in a sensible, or manage them in a sensible way, and also not changing passwords too often. That is also about making things easy, and to some extent, I mean, a lot of those things are very much in line with NCSC guidance these days. They're all about 3 random words. They've got guidance on their website about that. Use of password managers, they kind of endorse these days. And it's kind of not surprising, really. They've got a bunch of behavioural scientists and psychologists working for them now, and a lot of these ideas are coming through to their policy. So, ideas of making things easy are of that nature. And then also generation. So, if you want people to generate good passwords, well, give them a generator. Like, the first company I worked for had a little desktop tool that would generate you a password. Well, actually, that was quite nice. So, if you want people to change, to set a good password, give them a tool that helps them do it, basically. So that's all the kind of. Okay, if we want people to have good password hygiene, there's things we can do to make it easy for them. Willingness. So it kind of gets a bit harder, but this is about making people want to do it. So there's a couple of things we can do here. One is about the kind of threat appraisal, so how much people understand this threat. And the second one is about social proof. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other things that can be done. So threat appraisal, we might kind of leverage personal context. So we might kind of say, okay, well, managing your passwords in your personal life is obviously important. With all those accounts you have out there, maybe even encouraging people to have a look at Have I Been Pwned, which is obviously a website that tells you where your password's been breached. That kind of thing will make people, the personal context is a powerful thing for people. And actually making them understand that the threat is real. It's not just me saying, password breaches happen all the time. If you get them to actually search on this website and see, oh dear, that can be a powerful thing that they can then take into the corporate world. So that's kind of about raising their understanding of the threat. And then social proof. I mean, if you can say to people, hey, 80% of your colleagues are setting their password in this way now, then people are likely to then kind of jump on the bandwagon. There's a kind of argument about whether that needs to be a true statement or not. I think the research would say it's kind of important that it is. Otherwise, if you ever make a statement like that, you kind of lose your credibility. I'm not sure there's a behavioural change model for that, but it's probably a graph at the bottom. And then readiness. Again, this is hard. So particularly in terms of password hygiene, because people don't do it very often. So it's great if you're in charge of the platform where you're setting a password, because at that point you could say, when you're setting a password, hey, the opportune moment is now. Now, please, remember to use a different password, or, set your password in this way. Unfortunately, there's not many technical measures that exist for kind of really delivering these prompts at that opportune moment. But one thing you can do is kind of expose people to messaging more than once a year. So maybe that's maybe that's posters, maybe that's kind of email. The thing is, you need to kind of find ways of delivering messages more than just once a year. And to some extent, the absence of this kind of ability to deliver prompts is what our business is about. But actually, irrespective of that, the key thing is to try and get messages to people more than once, and ideally close to the point when they actually have to kind of make the behaviour change. So that's password hygiene. I don't know why I started with that. It was kind of a hard. So phishing, I guess everybody knows about phishing, and it's a kind of key risk. So I thought I'd try and apply the models to this one as well. So again, going through the model, able, so making it easy for people. So kind of easy to remember. I guess my key point here is not to overcomplicate. I guess my observation is that kind of phishing awareness and phishing training is often quite complicated, and I think that's driven by the fact that the people who typically write it are information security professionals, and they think about these things a lot, and they have quite good mental models of, okay, I know what a phishing email looks like because it will have, certain domain characteristics, and but the recipients probably don't understand a lot of that. So there's a tendency to kind of overcomplicate phishing awareness training, and to some extent it can boil down to people need to be cautious with email, right? And if that's kind of a really simple, easy message to deliver to people, rather than remember to hover the URL. If it looks like if it's not the domain that the email's from, then be cautious. That's a hard message that's hard for people to do. So on that axis of willing and able, that kind of goes towards the hard side of things. Whereas it's kind of a bit easier to be, okay, well, just remember there's bad things in email, and you need to be a bit suspicious about your email. That's an easier thing for people to do, right, and arguably more realistic. And if you do that, well, then the other thing we can do is make it easy to act. So if there's a simple message that says, well, if you're suspicious about email, then report it, that's, again, easy. So that's easy for somebody to do. And so there's things like reporting buttons that can make it easy for people to do that action and to do that behaviour. So things like that are easy actions for people to achieve. And then willingness. So we want to make people. So if the action we're actually trying to get them to do is to report email, report suspicious email, then how do we make people willing to do that? So we can raise their threat appraisal, which means make them more aware of the threat. So we could do things like publicising how many phishing emails the business receives, or how many get reported. Well, publicise that number, because that drives people to understand, okay, the threat is real. We can actually distribute real examples of phishing emails. It kind of surprises me how often phishing awareness training is based on cartoon pictures of emails. And that doesn't, it kind of helps to some extent, but actually giving people exposure to real examples of phishing emails, if we really want them to kind of be aware of the threat, is a much more powerful way of doing it. And then if we want to drive them towards reporting, social proof again. So we could publicise how many colleagues have been reporting. 400. We received 450 reports this month. People are then much more likely to engage and say, oh, if my friends and neighbours are doing it, then maybe I'll jump on the bandwagon. Which I guess if you're the SOC manager responsible for managing phishing reporting, may or may not be a good thing. And then finally, readiness, so prompting. And actually for phishing there's a couple of opportunities, because timeliness we know is key. We want the prompt to be delivered when people are in email. And actually phishing buttons and visible phishing buttons, I presume everybody knows what a phishing reporting button is. It's the idea that in Outlook you have a kind of single click way of reporting a phishing email, and it kind of says phishing ? In big friendly letters. So that's actually quite a good prompt. It's not an ideal prompt, but it's not a bad prompt. That when people are in email, they need to think about phishing, and that's kind of all you're trying to prompt. You're trying to tell people, remember that phishing thing that we talk about? Well, now you're using your email. Now is the time to think about it, and that's kind of the nature of the prompts we're trying to get across. How am I doing for time?
Well, you've got a clear 1 minute.
Okay, clear minute, great. So, some observations. So, I guess from those two kind of use cases, there clearly isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to these things. You have to kind of think about, okay, given the behaviour I want to change, how am I going to go? What kind of levers can I pull to make this happen? We typically think about kind of these behaviours as a campaign. So, bad idea is to try and change all the behaviours all at the same time. That really is, people just get confused. best case, pick out one behaviour and then really work at that behaviour and kind of think about it as a campaign. Okay, I'm going to try and get people to report phishing emails. If that's the behaviour, then kind of pick at that and go for that for 6 months, a year. Don't try and do too much. And if you want to identify which behaviour to go for first, then look at your risk register, because that's, you can see which are the biggest risks. It's fairly easy to identify which of those are underpinned by a behaviour, a human behaviour, and then kind of pick at the one that's at the top of your risk register, effectively. And I think that's it. I had a couple of bonus slides which I won't go on to, but we did this slide is all about, we did some research with Northumbria University funded by Innovate UK. We did some workshops with some end users and asked them what they thought about security awareness, how they felt about security awareness. And the first exercise we did was we got them to write on a post-it note, draw us an emoticon of your feelings about security awareness. So here's a sample of their emoticons. We didn't get many smiley faces, but yeah, we got a bunch of things like that. So anyway, I think I'm done. But I'm happy to take questions if anybody has questions.
Yeah, yes, one question. Sorry, you mentioned the some tools, techniques, etc. Kind of.
Just 3 or 4 minutes of questions, because then you can take some more later.
Okay. Yeah.
So you mentioned that, and how would you measure the ROI of implementing those measures versus like, okay, this is what we had, and then we try to do all these things, and then we are how do we measure that?
Well, I guess so. The models don't kind of built in an ROI, so it comes down to the design of the campaign. So if your ROI is around phishing reporting, if your campaign's about phishing reporting, then your measure is obviously number of reported phishing emails. If it's password change, it's obviously a bit less obvious. I suppose you can do some offline analysis of password strength and then say, okay, well look, how password strength rose by X%. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, and there isn't a one-size-fits. I mean, they're measures. They're not even ROI, right? So it's kind of there's no magic solution, and there kind of never is with that kind of thing, unfortunately.
Can you mention services that you deliver? Is it only about phishing and passport, or some other like services that you deliver to clients?
Oh, so sorry. The question is about services we deliver to clients. We're a software business, so we have basically created a software platform that delivers prompts at opportune moments. So we don't. You're
not providing really a framework for.
No. So we don't go in and advise. We're not an advisory business. We're a software business. We're a technology business. Yeah.
For only prompting or something else?
So it's a security awareness platform basically, which includes it includes push engagement. So the idea that rather than getting people to come to security awareness, so you might log in and do your kind of annual training. So we do.
So what's your then link to your website?
It's thinkcyber.co.uk. Yeah. Sorry. Yes.
Do you think very interesting? And do you think we've got the balance between the traditional view of security awareness, fixing the human, versus fixing the tech? What I liked about your presentation, the aware section, was actually a lot about fixing the tech to make it easier, able, as you said, for humans to act in a secure way.
Yeah.
The traditional model has been, here's an IT system that we've built, humans engage with it, human beings act in a kind of a standardized way that we've modeled in economics, rational way. Actually, it ends up being humans don't always act in a rational way.
Yeah.
So actually trying to focus on the human is probably not giving us enough benefit. We need to focus on the IT and make that.
Yeah. So the question is on the balance between fixing the human and fixing the technology.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. A lot of these things are, a lot of the need for behaviour change is because arguably technology is not doing its job properly, or hasn't been implemented properly, or implemented well. And it's funny, so we've done quite a bit of work with various kind of academics and psychologists, and it often does come down to, well, if the tech was properly implemented, then this wouldn't be a problem. And the solutions to these things are often improve implementation, or, okay, rather than making people manage lots of passwords, implement single sign-on, or implement some way of removing passwords. The psychologists often come out with a solution which is, well, let's just get rid of the problem and use technology to do it. I think there's a need for both in practice, and yeah. I think the thing is, it doesn't have to be technology, and one of the things I was trying to avoid was, these behaviour change techniques don't have to be technology driven. You have to think about them, but if you've got security champions, they can help prompt people, or posters are not without some use, as long as there's a consistent messaging, and people just need repeat exposure to these things. If you just expect to say something once, our password policy is X, Y, or Z, and expect people to apply it, and it's never going to happen. If you really care about people setting good passwords, for example, then do the half-hour training, but also do some make sure they see the message multiple times, maybe send some emails, do some, get your champions to focus on it. Don't just do one thing. And I've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Please join me in welcoming Rafe Nieuwissen.
All right, hands up if you're ready to have some fun. Okay? Hands up if you prefer to hear me talk about how to hack a human. I'm kidding. Right, this won't take long, as they say. This actually appeared on my screen when I had a Microsoft Windows 8 machine I hadn't switched on for 2 years, and it was followed by the message, installing 868 updates. So I spent rather too much of my time learning how to hack a human. I think in the end I spent about 2 years on this project, ended up with a book on it, and the working title originally was how to, yes, the one in my pocket. I'm like wired for sound. I feel like sort of a budget version of Madonna. Obviously I have better hair. So. Okay, thank you. So, the objective of this is to give you some valuable insights into how to hack a human. So can I have a quick show of hands? Who thinks that during the course of today your mind has already been hacked, that somebody already managed to do some kind of successful hack? Okay, only a few, that's good. By the end of this presentation, you might have changed your mind. So we're going to teach you effectively how to manipulate minds. But we don't want to teach you how to manipulate minds so you can manipulate them. We want to do it so you can learn how to defend minds, okay? So some of this stuff will be useful for security awareness, but I think you'll find this useful on a personal level. And also, if you have to do presentations ever, you're going to find out what the secret is to control and influence there as well. What inspired me to this originally were a number of events. They might have been in the media, I don't know, but a few things around Brexit, Trump, and all these Cambridge Analytica, etc. And this really got me thinking, because there were a lot of experts came forward and they had a silo of really interesting information. But what I wanted to do was look across the various silos and work out the threads that go in between. What really does hacking humans mean? And one of the interesting things that arrived across my desk, because of course psychographics, talking about how personal information gets used at that time, was I received not one but two actually breach emails from the same company that went, "Dear valued guest," so valuable apparently they didn't know my name. And to précis this, it effectively told me that they'd found a cybersecurity hole in the Starwood system. Well, not really a hole, more of a chasm, because of the number of millions, hundreds of millions of personal details that leaked out. And it really got me thinking about, when you think about privacy data and human hacking, these are all kind of interlinked subjects and topics. And let me just ask you another question. So if we think about what's the easiest way to hack into an organization, I'll give you 3 options before we vote on them. So we could have, let's say, the ultra-secure, highly configured desktop environment, which hopefully you have. The corporate servers, which are also, let's hope, hardened security configuration, or the end user. So hands up who thinks it's the desktop, anyone who thinks it's the servers, who thinks it's the end users. Okay, big show of hands there. So we recognize that actually the easiest way to hack a human is probably, to hack even a technology environment is through the end users. And yet it's interesting because when we talk about cybersecurity, most of what we talk about is common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVEs, the technical issues, which is important. But I mean, here's a human hack. So look at this, right? Is this image, it's an optical illusion. Is this a still image or is it moving? Okay, but if you look at it, it seems to move because when your eyes move around the optical illusion, the image appears to move. And it's just an example of how vulnerable our minds are. So I should give you a warning at this point. I am going to do a few hacks. I will explain when I do them. There's nothing too subversive. Although to evidence the fact that I'm going to hack your mind, I'm going to make you remember a really useless piece of information. Oh, what am I doing? I should be using some of these covert techniques already. That's better. So here's the same message. All I've done is change the imagery and the fonts and so forth. And the impact is entirely different. And we underestimate sometimes, how much the subconscious aspects really impact us. And this is interesting. So when I started and went through and did the first draft of the book, my copy editor came back and said, Rafe, you need a psychologist. I was hoping she meant for the book rather than personally. Fortunately, my expertise is cybersecurity. I write books on it. I actually have sold a few tens of thousands, so I earn from my book writing these days. I don't have to go through too much of the operational cybersecurity stuff anymore, thankfully. And by the way, as you're all ISACA members, apart from one person, you can get Guide for Healthcare, which was one I did for ISACA, free through isaca.org if you want that one. But what I really needed was a psychologist. And, back a slide. So this was the psychologist I used, Dr. Marina Maywisser. Fortunately, my sister, so she didn't charge me for the time. But I needed to have a psychologist look through it, make sure that there was nothing too egregious to the psychology community. And my aim was to do this. What I wanted to do was take the cybersecurity approaches, things like the kill chain, and look at all the ways that we can hack humans, social engineering, confidence tricks, and so forth, and see whether or not we could apply cybersecurity defensive methods to the ways in which people hack the human mind. So that was my objective. And let's just define what we mean by human hacking, right? So we're talking about intentional manipulation. That is, you might have thought you wanted to make a particular decision, or you're going to take a certain action, or you have a particular opinion or belief. How could we change that through some kind of coercion or covert technique, something you're not necessarily going to notice? Because that, to me, is human hacking. It's doing things to change the outcome without being noticed. So in a normal situation, you go in and things happen. But in human hacking terms, what happens is you go into the situation, somebody introduces one or more human hack, and as a result of that, the outcome is different. And let's show you that in practice. Here's a demonstration. So imagine you go to a hotel booking site and you see this. It's a room, it's £129 a night. You'll probably just continue looking. But what happens if you introduce a bit of psychology to it? So here, it's the same room, it's the same price. But now we've introduced a few pieces of psychology. Specifically, we've said, there's only one room available. 4 people have booked in the past hour. And the normal price is £70 higher. So now your feel of the fear of missing out, there's fear, uncertainty and doubt, and your likelihood of booking the room, if that's what you were after, is much, much higher, just because, this looks like useful information, right? It looks like really information, like when you go onto a site and it says people who bought this also bought. Oh, did they? Why did they buy that? Let's look at those. So Emotions, as Mike had mentioned, are a really strong driver, and we'll come on to more of that in a while. But if we think about the various ways that the human can be hacked, there are lots of them. Too many to go into in any great detail, but in large swathes of categories we can think of confidence tricks and social engineering and conscious persuasion, things like going to a presentation like this, where you know you're going to be given something, subconscious persuasion techniques, bullying and coercion, which when I approached this I didn't think I would find in use much, but actually is used a heck of a lot, surprising. And of course we all know about feeding in misinformation as real information, fake news for example. And fake news, if you think about it, is used both ways, both to to push out fake news as real news, but also to label real news as fake news so you doubt its integrity. But all of these are reliant on manipulating the human brain. So I had to spend some time looking at the human brain. Here's a human brain. This is a very simplified cross-section, but let's just look at some of the key facts here. Well, to start with, I want you to understand that the human brain is actually remarkably similar to a computer. For a start, it runs on around 20 watts of electricity. So within your body you generate electricity to actually run certain things, and your brain consumes around 20 watts of electricity. And recently they worked out with the number of cells and neurons and axons and etc. in your mind, there is the equivalent of approximately a petabyte of information that can be held in the human brain. But unfortunately you can't decide how you're going to use that petabyte of information. But to put a petabyte into more realistic terms, if you were to have a 140-page document on every person on the planet, that's about 7.7 billion people right now, that still would leave a lot of space left over. It still wouldn't be up to a petabyte of information. So there's a considerable amount of information there. It operates like a complex organisation, so all these different pieces of the brain do different things. They might process visual feed, audio feed, they might work on reasoning, how you store memories. Also, a lot of what's going on in the brain at any point in time is not conscious. So you have a very thin layer called the corpus callosum that is labelled there. And you're coping with a very small amount of things at a conscious level at any point in time. Most of what's going on is either at the subconscious or unconscious level. I mean, you don't have to think, I better make my heart beat. That happens at an unconscious level. Your heart beats, you breathe. In fact, if you consciously try and stop breathing, you'll lose consciousness and the unconscious mind will take over. And of course, your brain keeps working even when you're asleep or when you're unconscious. If they knock you out for an operation, your heart still beats, you still breathe. And in fact, they've also been able to show that your ears still work, you still hear things, you just can't consciously recall that afterwards. But one of the interesting things that Marina pointed out to me was that psychologists effectively think that 90% of how we come to making any decision happens at a subconscious and unconscious level. That is, that when we make a decision, we use something called implicit memory. So we might have been shaped by past experiences, past events. We won't necessarily know we're referring to those when we're making a decision, but they help shape the way that we're making those decisions. And again, continuing our analogy that the human brain is like a computer, we've got a range of sensors, and there are only basically 5 ways to get information in. So through the eyes, the ears, and so forth. And I want to show you how we can use those to hack the human. Now, Mike had mentioned nudge unit earlier in his presentation. So nudge theory is quite good. It basically says you can do a very, very small change to something, and it will completely change the outcome of a situation. So let's show you how those different sensors that you have as humans can be used. And the first one we're going to start with is the eye. Now this is a urinal in Schiphol Airport. Schiphol Airport. Should never drink before doing a presentation, right? So basically the manager in this airport had a very clever idea. He said, we've got a lot of spillage around the gents' urinals. How about if we introduce a photorealistic fly, here it is, on the urinal, see if that has any impact. And what happened was, just as a result of this photorealistic fly being there, the spillage around the urinals dropped by 80%. Only a problem maybe if a real fly appears behind the urinal. But so this had a massive impact, but practically imperceptible to people. Here's another one. 2 UK universities collaborated, and they with a supermarket, and what they did, they looked at the current levels of wine sales by country, and then they, with agreement from the supermarket, played either distinctly French or distinctly German music in the background to see if it affected the wine sales. And sure enough, they played distinctly French music, and what happened was the sales of French wine went up. They played distinctly German music. They finally sold some German wine. And the really interesting thing was, when they asked customers when they got out, chosen this wine, it's very nice, what led you to buy this wine? Not a single one of them mentioned the music or even referred to the music as being an influencer. So it had definitely influenced them, but it was definitely at a level that they hadn't perceived. Here's two more, okay? So we're going to look at both smell and touch here. You walk through a food court or you walk past a restaurant, and the smell of the food, actually I'm quite hungry. It triggers you to think about the food and to want to maybe, you might have been hungry for a while, but the smell will actually nudge you towards making a decision there and then. And similarly, in touch, there have been other surveys and studies studies I should say in this case, where they've worked out that if you're holding a warm drink, so let's say I want Deep, the president of ISACA London chapter, to give me something. If I put a hot drink in his hands, obviously not tip it over, but he's more likely to be generous than if he doesn't have a drink in his hands. And in fact, if I put a cold can of something in his hands, he'll be less generous. So who knew? But these things have an impact, and they have a tangible impact that can be measured. And this is interesting. And it made me think about, decision-making models. And one of my favourites, there are many, but one of my favourites was the Herbert A. Simon's The Theory of Bounded Rationality. And what the theory of bounded rationality says is that when we make a decision, we think about three key dimensions. We think about tractability. That is, can we change the decision? Can we improve the options, change the options? So that's how much can we change what we're being asked to decide upon. Cognitive limitations, not just how intelligent we are, but how much experience we might have of a particular situation. And also time, how much time, not do we have in general, but how much time do we have for this particular decision, given what it's all about. And one of the more interesting or most interesting parts was he said, when we make a decision, we don't look to make the best possible decision. We look to balance out a satisfactory, good enough decision that's efficient, that's time efficient. And he called this satisficing. So he said, we don't make the optimum decision, we look for a satisficing decision. And when you think about all the factors that go into a particular decision, you realize when we make a decision, it's like a very complicated equation. And just like a complicated equation, and this is very much why nudge works, if you just change one single component in there, it can change the overall outcome of the sum. And the challenge is that when I looked at it, like if you've got computers, obviously we know we should patch them regularly, but we're analog people living in a digital world. It's very hard to patch the human mind. Technology is moving a lot quicker than us. And as I went through, I didn't expect to find quite as many design vulnerabilities in the human mind as I did. There are literally thousands of them. I wanted to compress something into a few hundred pages. I could have gone for thousands of pages. And to give you some of the broad categories, and again, Mike had touched on this earlier, we love shortcuts and simplicity. Even if a simple model doesn't fully explain something, if it's satisficing, if it does it enough, we like it, we'll use it. And again, we underestimate the power that subconscious has on us. And if you think about psychological operations, you might think, these countries, some of them have very big psyops units. But the marketing budgets, which are also interested in control and influence, have budgets that are substantially larger on the big tech companies than any country psyops organization. Here's another example. Okay, I have to be careful with this, so a bit of a warning. If you are sensitive, you might want to turn away. I was looking for a traumatic image that you couldn't unsee, but obviously I had to bear in mind that it had to be legal. So look away now. I think it suits me. Here's another example of a design vulnerability. I'm not even going to tell you what this number is, right? But this is working on the law of reverse effect. Do not remember this number. And the law of reverse effect is working like this. Your conscious mind is told, do not remember this number. Your subconscious mind goes, what number? Conscious mind goes, I'm not going to tell you what number because you need to forget it. Subconscious mind goes, well, I can't know that I've forgotten it unless I know it. And in any battle between the subconscious and the conscious, the subconscious mind wins. So when you hear a salesman like, forget about the excellent value for money that this product is, don't think about the fuel economy, what they're not asking you not to think about it, they're actually making sure they implant the suggestion, as firmly as possible. So you're not allowed to remember that number. Here's another example, okay, this is called the decoy effect. So if there are two candles, there's a small and a medium one here. You're in the market for a scented candle. So who wants to buy the small candle at this point? Timid hands. Who wants to buy the medium one? None, okay. Well, okay, and now if we introduce the larger one at this ludicrous price, who wants to buy the medium candle now? Who thinks the medium candle? Okay, yeah, well, so there's a murmuring. But they use this, for example, in cinemas, when you get the popcorn, where you can get a thing of popcorn for $4.99, you can get a hot dog for $4.99, but you get the two together for $5.99. Wow, amazing value. So these are just ways to influence the value that you're assigning to different options in ways that don't necessarily swing you towards the most expensive item, but swing you towards buying the thing that they really want to sell. And you see this all the time. You see it like in deals, and this is using attentional bias because it's highlighting the option they really want you to have, and decoy effect and all those kind of things. So you'll see that as a generic example. I could find real ones, but I was worried about being sued. Now, if you want to do presentation, so let's go back to conscious persuasion. So if you wanted to land a really good presentation, and I'm sure you've seen good presentations and bad presentations, right? Don't tell me which one this is. But in a really excellent presentation, what you find is there's a nice, strong story or theme that runs through it. It has a nice, logical flow. It doesn't seem to go off on a, tangent. It has value in terms of value to you. You're thinking, I can use this information. This is going to be useful to me. You are convinced about the credibility of the person delivering the information. And, of course, I need to have access to you to give you a presentation, but also the environment has to be right. If we were out in the street with lots of noise and you couldn't hear me, and timing as well has to be correct. So, if people are not giving you the time to put the message across, that's not going to work. So these are, for example, the ingredients if you want to consciously influence someone. It's quite hard. Subconscious, on the other hand, is a piece of cake. All you need is basically access and then to drop in the piece, right? So, like with the nudge theory pieces, and I'm not slighting because I think Mike is absolutely right, but I think one of the things that the behavioural insights you mentioned, to do nudge, it doesn't have to be attractive. And let me give you an example. If I dropped a stink bomb over here before you came in, apart from getting arrested, I would be pretty sure that people would move away from it because it's unattractive. You could argue it. So what I have found is that a lot of the ways in which human hacking works, and we'll see some more examples, is by making things unattractive to push you towards the option they want. So it's just, that's less unattractive than what I'm being offered over there. Another way you'll see this is in one-page websites, right? So years ago, we used to get this thing where you've got a website and you've got 5 different tabs. But now you have this thing where you literally just can scroll down and everything's on the one page. And why is that? Well, why ask people to make a decision? Do you want to see my next page? Well, you can just push the next page on them, right? And this is the same thing with the endless scroll. When you go to a platform and it just loads more content as you scroll down. It used to be, right, do you want to go to page 2? So I don't know. Do you want to refresh this page? They don't ask you the question. And why don't they ask you the question? Why ask for the decision? It's another form of using kind of covert tactics to get the result you want. And in that breach email, it was quite interesting because when I looked through the language, and again, this is not to pick on these because you can see it everywhere, but every positive mention in the email was Marriott. You know, Marriott values my privacy, etc. But this was a Starwood breach, and every mention of Starwood was in the negative. So it's interesting because actually, if you look at anything, popular retail web pages and so forth, you'll find them absolutely stuffed full of these kind of things. So if we think about, you know, cyber attack, a technology attack, and then we compare it to a human hack, the main difference is that we're just talking about cognitive weaknesses rather than security vulnerabilities. And people are a maze of cognitive vulnerabilities. And I am going to give you some useful pointers that you can use to help defend that and to use in your security awareness training. But this was quite an eye-opener. Let's give you another example. So let's consider something like the delivery driver scam. Okay, so anybody heard of this? I should imagine a lot of you have. Okay, so really briefly, this is how it runs for anybody who hasn't heard of this before. Somebody turns up at your house. They may be dressed like a proper, legitimate, they may have stolen a uniform or made one up. They've got a box, and maybe the box is branded with the courier logo. And they turn up and they say, they've got this package for you, but there's £1 that you still needs to be paid. It's up to you. I can't take cash. You can either scan your card and have the goods, or I can leave you this card. You can visit the URL and you know, you can book it, but I'll have to take it away now. And if you scan your card, what happens is, you know, they've prepared, they've approached, they've delivered the bait, they've convinced you they're there under a legitimate thing. Then they've got the exploit, they've got your credit card details and signature, and if not that, you might go to the URL and they might get you that way. They take the payoff and then they withdraw. So if we think about that from a social engineering perspective, when I approached social engineering initially, I thought, well, I'll have to look at the individual techniques. But I came to realize that most really effective things, you know, a phishing email isn't usually just a phishing email. It usually uses other covert tactics within it. And if we think of the delivery driver scam, there was pretexting. So somebody was pretending to be somebody that they weren't. We had a quid pro quo. That is, they're saying, I'll give you something of perceived high value in return for something of perceived low value. You know, and this was the thing, that there were, in the most compelling and effective forms of human hacking, it wasn't just a single tactic that was being dropped in. They were nudging all over the place, right? And they were doing things to try and persuade that. And of course, we're all familiar with hopefully with the advanced persistent threat, because I know you're all cybersecurity people. But if we compare human hacking again to, you know, the advanced persistent threat, I noticed that a lot of these, reconnaissance, weaponize, deliver, exploit, they're all happening. But what wasn't happening initially in my analysis, well, I thought, well, this is funny because, you know, the most effective technical hacks involve embed and expand command and control. So surely the most compelling human hacks would do the same thing. Like dwell time, right? You don't want to just do it once because that's quite elaborate and expensive. I began to think of this as the subscription phase of human hacking, because getting access and, you know, putting all the social proof and everything else around it takes time and effort. But if you can do it repeatedly, so think about your average cookie and privacy permissions box that you see these days. It's using forms of bullying and coercion because it's saying you can't read the page until you click on this, right? It's using attentional bias because it's making it clear, accept all. Rarely does it have a reject all or, you know, those kind of options. And I also realized what was used a lot, I've called it fuzzing, which of course fuzzing is usually a technical term for putting too much information into a memory buffer so that overloads and corrupts another piece of the system. But in the human mind, what fuzzing is basically it's making you think that there's so much effort involved in doing the other path. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried to find the other link and then go to it and then read all the privacy permissions for hours on end and then find out at the end, by the way, you have to come back regularly because we change them all the time. It's your responsibility. But if you click on that accept all, I did a count on a number of different commercial websites and I found that you're typically accepting permission from about 200 plus different organizations to track your privacy behavior, not just on that website, but across anything else you surf to where they've placed cookies. So this is interesting, and it's really, speaking to that embed and expand. And in fact, marketing, what they say, the best way of actually selling a product is to embed something as a habit. So if you go to a page regularly, you use something regularly, it just makes it that much easier to sell to you. And just conscious of time, the privacy aspects. So the amount of privacy data, when I started looking at this, privacy information is very useful for human hacking. If you think of reconnaissance, I might be able to generically hack, and I've demonstrated some generic hacks here, but if I specifically know what you're interested in, what your interests are, how agreeable you are, how open you are, these kind of things, then I can make the human hack far more compelling than if I'm just doing it, blind without actually understanding about you. And the amount of information that is out there now, typically in a large tech company, can stretch to gigabytes per person. There is too much to list. But I mean, as an example, for an ISACA interview for the magazine, they asked me what my interests are. And I made a list of a few, and I thought, I wonder if Twitter knows. So I looked at my interests on Twitter, and Twitter knew more about my interests than I did. And I was like, I am interested in that. Oh, yeah. But this is the thing, that actually privacy information these days, there's gigabytes maybe per organization, but there are hundreds of organizations that are collecting the information. And this provides them an ability, especially if you think about breaches, because, you might trust those organizations with the data, you might have consented to it. But, when the information gets breached, as we saw with, for example, Cambridge Analytica, then the situation could get worse. So if we think about, how can we defeat those? I'm going to give you a simpler defeat, but from a basic perspective, you want to limit the amount of personal data, but that is very difficult. I actually managed to close down a device so that it literally was unable to reveal anything about me. No IP address, no MAC address, no this, no that. And I went to a popular search engine, which I won't mention again for legal reasons, and it just didn't give me the page. It basically said, we can't get any information about you, so you can't have the service, which is interesting. Preparation and tooling. We can defeat. So as it becomes known that something is a method of hacking, it loses its power. So the only real way to change weaponizing and tooling is to make our communities aware, hey, these hacks happen in this way, and in that way you basically negate the power of those weapons and those tools. But it's an ever-evolving feast. If you think about social proof, as Mike had mentioned, social proof is a big thing. Years ago, everyone trusted reviews to be accurate, but now most of us know that you go to a review. How many of you trust reviews that you see? Okay, no hands there. Okay, so again, in the delivery, delivery always requires access. So this is the reason a lot of ultra-secure environments basically don't provide any external access and air gap certain environments. Okay, they're the ultra-high security. But effectively, if a really clever human hacker knows the target, knows what they're interested in, they can often make the hack far more convincing than something that is actually real that just doesn't look real. Here's an example. Somebody came to me with an email one organization was in and said, the HR department are saying I need to log into an external site to, look up my payroll details using my standard username and password. This can't be right, but it was. It's very unadvisable from a security standpoint, but they'd actually set up a third-party website with an unprotected access to the... Anyway, so that was a real email, but it looked way like a scam. And then conversely, another successful phishing scam, somebody sent out something that looked like the restaurant menu, from the canteen, the staff canteen, but that was a phishing email. So it's very hard if a hacker has access to stop them working. But there are lots of technical controls you can put in place. In terms of exploiting, human hacks mostly rely in remaining unnoticed, because if you know that they're a hack, or if you know that they're going to persuade or influence you, you automatically then start to negate the power of it. So in terms of exploiting, being able to identify them, you can negate their power. And again, I like to be very careful now where I subscribe, what I'm subscribing to, where I share my personal data, because I know there's a lot out there, but it's still worth taking care with those things. So here's some summary points, right? The human brain has thousands of design vulnerabilities, but the main thing we can think about is that in order to work, just like this iceberg, the majority of what's happening has to be below the conscious radar. They're reliant on the fact. So when you encounter things and you're making a decision, if you reverse think, why have I come to this decision? Like, why have I suddenly decided I need to eat or drink or buy this or whatever? You can usually then identify what happened and then make your own mind up as to whether or not you really want to go through with it. And of course, as we said, it requires access. But the useful thing, especially for security awareness training, I always think of these as, there's the indicators of compromise, but I think of these as the indicators of human compromise. The first one of these I call the mouldy bread option. It's where you go and you think, well, that's funny, I would have expected an option for this, and it's not there. And the only options you have don't appear to be really the options you'd like the accept all and the cookie permissions box. There are various scenarios where you're thinking, well, actually, so you can use that as an alarm bell to say, okay, why is not the logical choice that I would expect not there? And you think, right, there is some kind of human hacking probably going on here. What's happening? The second thing is, of course, time pressure. We've got to do this right now. If we don't do this, then something's going to happen. In the majority of cases, time pressure is not time pressure because there's a genuine need. It's a useful tool for hackers. So not to say, if there's an earthquake or something like that, you don't have to stop and think, oh, is this a hack? But, if you're really feeling pressure to do something extraordinary or unusual, that again is a good indicator of human compromise. And of course, emotions. The strongest emotion to drive human hacking is fear of loss. To feel threatened. That's why a lot of people talk about FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So again, if your emotions are really heightened, and people do this in a negative way, so they will convince you that they might be trying to push you towards a particular decision, and you think you're making the right decision because you're going the other way, but in fact that's how they can use it. They can try and make it look like they're trying to make you make this decision because they want you to make that one. And what I wanted to touch on briefly was artificial intelligence. Because as a human, and all of us here, we could learn tens, maybe even hundreds of different ways of doing the human hacking. It's difficult to keep them all in mind, at one point in time. But what's also difficult is, if I want to know all the information about a particular member of the audience here, I can't wade through 5 gigabytes of information, find out where you've surfed, what your interests are, what your opinions, where you live, what your income level is, do you own a home, what's your marital status, and all the hundreds of other data points. But artificial intelligence doesn't have these limitations. And although there isn't artificial general intelligence yet, it is possible to program up a huge number of, these are the ways in which the human mind operates, these are the vulnerabilities, these are the weaknesses, and to be able to read things. So in future years, you could be calling a call center, speaking to an artificial intelligence that's handling your call. It will be able to know everything about you, more than you know about yourself. It'll know how to model the conversation. It could know what it could say to you, what you'd like to say back. It could play through millions of different varieties and combinations of it and decide what to say to you. But how we're going to see this immediately is things like laser phishing, which is actually more targeted versions of phishing, where it will be tailored to the individual, but it won't require a person to do it. They'll just be able to go, okay, here's all the information about them, and their email address and so forth, and then you could write a really compelling phishing email that looks so specific. Oh, we hear you going for a job, we heard it from Dave, and and give his legitimate details, and there's this fantastic opportunity here, but you've got to move quickly, you're going to have to phone this number, and so the things could really resonate with you far more than even legitimate communications. So artificial intelligence is going to become a factor, a significant factor. And now don't use this one. I'm going to show you how you could theoretically increase your cybersecurity budget using human hacking. So, imagine that Deep is my manager. He's the CEO. And I go to him, Deep, I bought you your favourite hot drink. Slide his favourite hot drink across the table. Wait till Deep is nursing it in his hands. And say, I just wanted to say, don't worry about the shareholders fretting about cybersecurity. I know there's a lot of threats and risks out there, and I will happily make sure that I can speak to those and put their minds at rest and make sure it's all covered. So now I've inserted that kind of fear, uncertainty and doubt in his mind. Then I'm going for the mouldy bread option. Presumptive suggestion. So did you decide on taking the 15% or the 25% budget increase this year? Okay, now what I've done here in presumptive suggestion is just literally, it's like, if you wanted to go to dinner with somebody, rather than going, would you like to go to dinner with me, then the presumptive suggestion goes, what time would you like to meet for dinner? 7:30. And this is an example of, presumptive suggestion. But these things can be quite powerful. Obviously, don't use this to extend your cyber budget. I hope nobody who I've appealed to for cyber budget is watching. But okay, so with that, I'd like to say thank you. And one final question I have is, what was the number you were supposed to get? Yeah, I did this in, so it was ISACA Netherlands in front of about 700 people, and they did a word cloud at the end, and that was the final thing from the whole conference. The most memorable thing of the whole conference was apparently the number 672. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and yeah. Any questions? And saying, Dallin, I know we're short on time, so the question was, when there's user resistance because you're expecting them to do a process that may take them a few minutes and be inconvenient, how is it possible to use these techniques to control and influence their behaviour? And the answer is, to an extent, it is. What you have to remember is, as we said, people like simplicity. They like things to be embedded in the process as far as possible. You're right. If you provide an overhead and they can't see the personal benefit. So your choice really is to either, like the one-page website, not require them to do it, but maybe get some data loss prevention software to do it or to put it into the flow. Or if you need them to actually do something manually, you're going to have to persuade them that it's a personal benefit for them, that there's, let's say, concern if they don't do it. What would happen if that file went out unencrypted? What would be the personal consequences? Because if they were responsible for a mega breach or something that was very costly to the company, that could be negative to them. But those are some of the ways. But it is, I would say, as I mentioned before, we're analog people living in a digital world. I think we can and should do security awareness training, but we need to be careful not to expect to put too much burden on the users, especially as a lot of the techniques are going to be so clever that unless you have automated checks and balances in the way, you can detect a certain amount, but a lot of the things that go wrong are just, more convincing than the regular things we're doing at work sometimes. So the question is, how can we win against, the power of artificial intelligence and things like that when it could be possessed and know so much about how to hack us? I actually think that we will end up in a situation with a lot of people either using artificial intelligence on their side as well to help as a gatekeeper, because they'll have to know it. But I think also people are just going to become much more savvy and aware. It will be like going into every situation knowing if I'm interacting with technology, I know it's going to be completely compelling. It's going to know everything about me. And I think that latent awareness will just happen over time as well. Again, summarize the question. We all basically have three strands. I think of it as emotional, financial and social aspects. We all want to feel right in those three areas. We want to feel loved, we want to feel well off, and we want to feel like we've got the friends and the social circles that we want to have. And how do we motivate people, using those, because people are different. And I think that the reality is that it's just about understanding that I think people are fundamentally the same. They do want all of those things. They might have them already to a certain degree. But certainly if you think about things like in intelligence services, they always want to know if people have got debt problems, okay, because then they know they're more financially susceptible. But then there's a challenge, because how much information, privacy information, would you want your employer to know about you? So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think to some extent you could profile it, but then there's ethical questions about profiling it in your employee base. But generally, the nub of just being able to successfully control and influence is just tuning in on, demonstrating that there's personal value in actually doing something in a particular way and personal detriment by not doing it, but obviously within acceptable bounds. So.
Thank you very much, Rafe, or as we now refer to you, Mr. 672. Forget I said that. Great. There is something that I want to know, though, Rafe, and that is, you've written loads of books.
Yeah.
Where do we get hold of them?
Oh, Amazon mainly. In fact, if you want a world exclusive, click the clicker once. I've just about finished my first fictional book, so that will be out in March. I was reading so much about psychopaths, so I got quite interested. So.
I've got a couple of things to tell you briefly, and then it's time for food and drink. The first of those things is that we have something coming up on Saturday, 5th of October, this Saturday, and it's called Community Day, and that's actually an ISACA global initiative, and in which chapters around the world are doing something for their communities. Now, I know that ISACA London is participating in this, but do we have somebody here who can tell us what exactly is happening and how you can participate? Okay. Deep, chapter president.
So certainly there is a process to get registered to be a volunteer for 5th of October, but also options are limited. We tried to approach several charity organizations around London, and they all told us that we need at least 6 months' notice to work with any organization. But we have actually approached and agreed with 2 volunteer organizations. So if you go and register yourself, you will get those 2 options, and hopefully all of you will get registered and get together on 5th of October, and there will be, I think we have ordered some T-shirts, so you can wear those T-shirts with pride and participate in the community day we have on 5th of October. Thank you very much.
Okay. Deep, that sounds good. What are the 2 options?
You can go on the website and find out.
Of course, right.
There's one charity in East London for cleaning up the gardens and other things. So check it out.
Cleaning up East London. Sounds good. Okay. Then, on Wednesday, the 9th of October, we have Digital Transformation Expo Europe. And that is a partner event of ours where you're invited to register, go along, and there are lots of good things happening at Excel. Click on the link in your newsletter or whatever, find out more. On the 9th of October in the evening, there is a BCS North London branch event right here. Oh, this sounds really boring. Blockchain, cryptocurrency, and you. But I'm joking, of course, because I put that together. And the the lead presenter, Erica Stanford, is the founder of something called Crypto Curry Club. Now, what is Crypto Curry? Well, Erica is quite a person. She stopped being interested in making money when she'd made her first million and turned to doing other things. And she's also bringing along the lead technologist for blockchain and distributed ledger at Digital Catapult. So that's a really interesting evening on Wednesday the 9th of October. Now, when you've had your fill of Wednesday the 9th of October, we have other things for you as well. And I'll just tell you about 2. One of them is, again, going to be here, but it's actually an ISACA London chapter event. It's on cybersecurity, again, and threat intelligence. And it's by quite a stunning speaker we have a whole bag full of them. Isn't that wonderful, you know? And this one is Professor Claudio Cilli, who some of you may have seen before and got a lot of rave reviews. This time he's going to be talking about how to define and build threat intelligence capability, and a whole lot more. And finally, on the 21st of November, he's going to be speaking again at BCS, but this time it's a BCS NLB event. Didn't want to let him go whilst we had the chance to get the most out of him. This time it'll be talking about social media and managing your security. Another really interesting session. That's on the 21st of November. And lots more coming up in the future. Don't miss any of that. You'll see it in your ISACA London chapter newsletters with links and so on. Do sign up, do participate. Let's get together and do lots of good things. Meanwhile, something for you. Right next door, Mike alias Ken.
CPE, please register.
Yeah, sure. But right now, two things for you. One of them is, if you haven't registered yet on the ISACA list, please see Yeshko and her fabulous list of barcodes, recognize your own and tick against it. And then please come next door, where there's lots of food, drink, and opportunities to network with each other. Thank you very much for being part of this.